Snow falls quietly over the ruins of a forgotten airfield in northern France. Beneath layers of rust and time, archaeologists uncover fragments of twisted aluminum, the remains of a bomber that vanished in 1944. Inside the wreck, they find a sealed canister still intact, still stamped with the emblem of the Royal Air Force. Within it, a journal, pages inked by a young navigator who never made it home. His words speak not of victory or glory, but of exhaustion, fear, and duty, of men trapped between history's machinery and their own fragile humanity. This is their story, the story of Flight Lancaster 409. Chapter 1. The World Before the Fire. Before the world tore itself apart, Europe still breathed with uneasy peace. Streets of London hummed with the rhythm of morning trams and laughter spilling from cafes. Across the Channel, in Berlin, banners of a rising power fluttered above rebuilt boulevards, promises of renewal that carried a darker purpose. The scars of the Great War had not yet healed. They merely hid beneath the surface, waiting. In 1938, the world stood on a precipice. Britain and France were tired, drained by memories of trenches and telegrams that once announced millions dead. They clung to diplomacy like a last candle in a windstorm. The League of Nations, built to keep peace, now felt like a ghost. Its warnings were quiet, its resolutions ignored. But in Germany, the air was different. It pulsed with confidence and fear. Factories worked through the night, smoke rising from new assembly lines where once only silence stood. Hitler's voice filled stadiums, his speeches echoing through radio sets in every home. We have been humiliated long enough. Crowds cheered, yet behind those cheers were whispers, neighbors vanishing, dissent punished, loyalty demanded. In the skies, a new kind of war was already taking shape. Britain had begun building its first heavy bombers, sleek metallic beasts designed to strike deep into enemy territory. Among them was the Avro Lancaster, a 4-engine aircraft that could carry more explosives than any bomber before it. Few could imagine that these machines, still gleaming and new, would soon define the night over Europe. Meanwhile, on quiet English farms, young men practiced navigation with compasses and charts under the light of kerosene lamps. They were mechanics, miners, and sons of teachers, drawn not by hatred, but by a sense that something terrible was coming. Many joined the Royal Air Force believing the skies were the future, a place of freedom and purpose. But freedom would soon take on a very different meaning. As 1939 dawned, the world still pretended peace was possible. In Warsaw, children walked to school beneath crisp winter air. In Paris, couples danced to swing bands, unaware that the same radios playing those songs would soon broadcast evacuation orders. Even in Berlin, soldiers kissed wives goodbye, promising they'd be home by Christmas. Then, on the morning of September 1st, the illusion shattered. German tanks rolled across the Polish border like steel thunder, and the world could no longer look away. Within days, Britain declared war. The long silence that had haunted Europe since 1918 broke again, replaced by air raid sirens, by orders scribbled in haste, by leaders staring into the unknown. For those who would serve in the air, the call to duty felt both noble and unreal. Letters from training bases spoke of pride, of camaraderie, of dreams of flying. But older men, those who remembered the mud of the Somme, said little. They knew what was coming. By the time the first British bombers took flight over Germany, the world had already changed. Cities began to dim their lights under blackouts, windows taped against shattering glass. Londoners practiced hiding in underground stations. And across the sea, a generation prepared for a kind of war no one truly understood. One that would burn not just the ground, but the very air itself. In those early months, before the great offensives began, Flight Lancaster 409 did not yet exist. Its crew members were still scattered across England, training, waiting, learning to trust the machines that would carry them through darkness. They were strangers, soon to be brothers. None of them could have known how their names would one day be found again, decades later, inside the wreckage of their aircraft. But history often begins quietly, in the calm before the fire. Chapter 2. Echoes of a Gathering Storm. The winter of 1939 was grey and heavy, filled with rumours and ration lines. Britain stood officially at war, but for months the skies remained strangely quiet. The press called it the phony war. Soldiers dug trenches in France that would never be used, and civilians waited for air raids that didn't come. Yet beneath that uneasy calm, decisions were being made that would shape the fate of millions. Inside the War Office on Whitehall, rooms glowed late into the night with cigarette smoke and murmured debate. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, not yet the legendary Bomber Harris, argued for a doctrine that would come to define the conflict. That air power could cripple the enemy not just by destroying armies, but by breaking morale. To him, the city itself, the heart of production, communication and will, was the true target. It was a cold, calculated idea, but to many, it seemed the only way to end what Germany had started. Across the Channel, in Berlin, Goering promised the German people invincibility. The Luftwaffe, he declared, was unmatched, a wall of iron in the sky. Propaganda filled cinemas with films of sleek Messerschmitts soaring above cheering crowds. But behind the triumph lay growing desperation. Britain's blockade was tightening, and resources were beginning to strain. Hitler's generals knew that speed was their only advantage, to strike before the Allies could recover. And still, Europe's civilians tried to live. Diaries from London speak of tea shops open under blackout curtains, of children chasing each other between sandbag walls, of laughter echoing faintly in air raid shelters. One entry from a schoolteacher in Coventry reads, "We go on as if nothing will happen. Perhaps that's what courage is." Meanwhile, at RAF Scampton, young men began to arrive for bomber training. Among them was Pilot Officer James Whitmore, 23 years old, from Yorkshire. His letters home were brief, modest, always ending with the same line, "We're doing what we can." Alongside him was Navigator David Lane, a quiet mathematics student from Cambridge, whose steady hands would later guide Lancaster 409 through blinding flak. Their crew slowly came together, a patchwork of accents and backgrounds, united by a single aircraft. They trained in freezing hangars, learning to read the stars, to plot bearings by feel alone. The ground crews worked silently through rain and frost, their fingers numb from tightening bolts and checking gauges. Each man knew that every error, every loose wire, could mean death. Yet morale remained high. They believed in each other. They believed in the machine. In Germany, the bombing of Warsaw had shown what air warfare could become. Whole districts flattened, civilians buried under rubble. The world watched in horror, but Hitler called it progress, a demonstration of modern power. British command took note. If the enemy would use the skies to terrify, then Britain would answer in kind. The transition from defense to retaliation was quiet, almost bureaucratic. New factories in Birmingham and Manchester began churning out engines and fuselages day and night. Women replaced men on assembly lines, riveting steel with oil-stained hands. Posters urged production with the phrase, "Keep them flying." By mid-1941, the first operational Lancasters rolled onto the runways, vast, beautiful machines with black bellies and silver wings. As the bombers took to the skies, so too did the moral debate. Was it right to target cities? To burn factories that stood beside homes? Winston Churchill wrestled with it privately, his diary noting the terrible arithmetic of necessity. Yet the raids went on. Each mission was framed as retaliation, each one meant to hasten an end that seemed no closer. At night, young crews like Whitmore's would sit in dimly lit briefings, tracing their routes across maps pinned to corkboards. Over Hamburg, over Bremen, over the Ruhr. The briefings were always the same. Altitude, weather, enemy defenses, expected resistance. But when the lights dimmed and the door closed, a silence would fall. The kind that only comes when men understand what tomorrow may cost. Back home, families listened to the BBC for news of returning squadrons. Reports were vague. Some aircraft did not return. Mothers marked dates in diaries, pretending not to count how many times their sons had flown. One letter from an airman's wife reads simply, "The radio said the weather was bad tonight. I pray that means they stayed low." By 1942, the raids had intensified. The RAF was no longer striking isolated factories but entire industrial regions. Cities burned in patterns visible from miles away. German propaganda painted the British as barbarians. British newspapers printed maps of successful hits. Each side measured success in tonnage dropped, in square miles destroyed. The human cost, the faces behind those numbers, remained hidden beneath the language of strategy. And yet, even in those days, there were small acts of grace. German civilians leaving milk for downed British airmen before the Gestapo could find them. RAF crews dropping leaflets with warnings before major raids, tiny, fragile gestures that defied the machinery of war. The men of Lancaster 409 would soon join that machinery. Their first mission orders would come in late spring of 1943, a night strike deep into the Ruhr Valley. They had trained for months, refined every signal and maneuver, but nothing could truly prepare them for what awaited above enemy territory. The sound of flak bursting like thunder, the smell of burning fuel, the weight of realizing that survival itself was a form of luck. In those last quiet days before deployment, Whitmore wrote a single line in his journal. "The war feels closer now." It's in the air. He was right. The storm was coming, not as a metaphor, but as 1,000 roaring engines filling the night sky. Chapter 3, Into the Fire, the night of the Ruhr raid. It began just after dusk on May 27, 1943. The air over Lincolnshire was cold and perfectly still. The kind of night pilots would later describe as too calm. On the tarmac of RAF Scampton, the men of Lancaster 409 prepared for their first major operation. The engines stood silent for now, black silhouettes against floodlights and mist. Each man followed his ritual, a photo in a pocket, a lucky coin, a letter tucked into a flight jacket. Pilot Officer James Whitmore climbed into the cockpit first, his breath visible in the chilled air. Behind him, David Lane unrolled his charts across the narrow navigation table, marking the route with red pencil. Wireless operator George Evans checked the radio frequencies, murmuring to himself. Tail gunner Charlie Burns, the youngest of them, only 19, climbed into his turret with a small grin. "Let's give them hell," he said softly, the words half joke, half prayer. At 21:43, the engines came alive. The ground trembled under 4 roaring Merlins, their sound rolling over the fields like thunder. One by one, the Lancasters lifted off, their navigation lights winking out as they climbed into the dark. From the ground, they vanished, just faint shadows swallowed by the night. The target was Essen, heart of the Ruhr Industrial Valley, home to the massive Krupp armament works. Intelligence claimed the skies would be clear, the flak light. But intelligence, as the men well knew, was often wrong. At 12,000 feet, frost crept across the cockpit windows. The moon hung low behind scattered clouds, turning the bombers into silver ghosts. Inside, the crew worked in practiced rhythm. Lane called bearings. Evans kept contact. Whitmore adjusted course. Burns scanned the horizon for the flicker of searchlights. For hours, they flew in near silence, their world reduced to the red glow of instruments and the distant hum of engines. Then, over the North Sea, came the first signs of trouble. Radio chatter burst to life, code words, warnings, fragments of panic. Bandits at 2 o'clock, tracers below. Keep tight formation. Whitmore glanced out his canopy and saw it. A distant explosion, an orange bloom against black water. Another bomber hit before reaching the coast. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. As they crossed into German airspace, the world changed. Searchlights erupted from the ground, white beams clawing at the sky, sweeping for movement. Tracer fire stitched through the darkness like angry comets. The smell of cordite seeped into the cabin. Lane's voice stayed calm, even as his hands shook slightly on the charts. 2 minutes to target. Below them, Essen burned. Whole blocks of the city were already in flames from the first wave. Smoke rose high enough to blur the stars. Whitmore gritted his teeth, pushing the throttle forward. "Hold steady," he ordered. "Bomb doors open." The bomb aimer, Sergeant Wallace, lay prone in the nose, his face inches from the glass. "Left a bit. Steady, steady." His voice was flat, emotionless. The voice of a man trying to separate duty from consequence. He pressed the release. A shudder ran through the plane as the bombs fell away. A deep, hollow thud felt more than heard. Seconds later, the night below erupted. The light was blinding, white and orange, the heat reaching them even at altitude. Burns swore softly in the turret. My God, the whole city. But there was no time to watch. Flak burst around them in black puffs, rocking the Lancaster violently. Shrapnel tore through one wing. Evans lost radio contact. Then came the shout, "Fighter!" 6 o'clock high. A Messerschmitt night fighter dropped in from above, cannons flashing. Burns opened fire, tracers arcing into the dark. "He's on us, Jim! He's on us!" The bomber shook under impact, the tail riddled with holes, instruments flickering. Whitmore yanked the control column hard left, the engines screaming in protest. The fighter overshot, circling for another pass. Smoke filled the cabin. Lane coughed, struggling to read his instruments. "Hydraulics are gone," he shouted. The right engine sputtered, then caught fire. Flames licked along the wing. "We're losing altitude! Feather number 4!" Whitmore barked. Evans reached for the control. Sparks erupted from the panel. The cockpit went dark. For a moment, the only sound was the wind. Then Wallace's voice again, small but steady. "We can make it back. Just get us out of here." Whitmore didn't answer. He could see the horizon tilting, the altimeter dropping fast. They cleared the flak zone, limping westward. One engine dead, another coughing. Burns kept watch, every muscle tense, his turret now silent. Minutes passed like hours. The adrenaline gave way to exhaustion, then to numb focus. Lane recalculated bearings by starlight, tracing invisible lines across the sky. "If we can make the channel," he whispered, "we'll be fine." But fate, as always, had its own orders. Over the Dutch coast, the burning engine finally gave way. A violent shudder, then a sound like tearing metal. The plane began to roll. Whitmore fought the controls, his hands slick with sweat. "Brace!" he yelled. "Brace!" The Lancaster struck the sea at 02:18 a.m. There was no explosion, just the cold hiss of water swallowing steel. Of the 7 men aboard, only 2 were pulled from the wreckage by Dutch fishermen at dawn. One died before reaching shore. The other, navigator David Lane, was taken prisoner and spent the remainder of the war in silence, the sole survivor of Flight Lancaster 409. For the rest of the squadron, the night went on. Others returned home, their bomb bays empty, their faces pale and quiet. When the final aircraft landed just before sunrise, the ground crews counted the losses. 6 did not return. In the logbook, beside Lancaster 409's call sign, an officer drew a single line and wrote one word beside it: "Missing." And with that, they moved on. Another night, another mission. The war allowed no time for mourning, but somewhere in the cold grey sea, the story of Lancaster 409 remained, silent, waiting beneath the waves for someone decades later to find it again. Chapter 4: Aftermath and the Long Silence. Morning came grey and windless over the airfields of Lincolnshire. The ground crews waited by the runways, hands in pockets, breath clouding in the chill air. They listened for engines, for the sound that meant home. But the horizon stayed empty. No roar of Merlins, no silhouettes breaking the dawn. Only the slow realization that some aircraft would never return. At the mess hall, coffee went cold on tables as the officers read through mission logs. Each call sign checked, each radio signal noted. When Lancaster 409 failed to respond, no one said anything at first. They simply moved on to the next. The war had a way of dulling the edges of grief. Not out of callousness, but survival. There would be another mission tomorrow. Back in England's towns, telegrams began to arrive. Short, impersonal notices typed in precise military font. "Regret to inform you, your son is missing in action." In Yorkshire, a mother fainted at the kitchen table when hers came. In London, a fiancé held the letter for hours before opening it. The words were always the same, but to each family they meant the world had stopped turning. For the survivors of the raid, the days after felt hollow. Those who made it back spoke little. They cleaned their uniforms, wrote brief reports, and prepared for the next flight. David Lane's name appeared on the missing list until word reached command through the Red Cross months later. Prisoner of war, location unknown. His parents received that update in a single line. It was hope, but not relief. In captivity, Lane lived through 2 winters. He worked in the camp's radio repair room, his hands rebuilding the same kind of instruments that once guided him through the night sky. Fellow prisoners remembered him as quiet, withdrawn, always sketching flight paths in the margins of torn paper. One recalled Lane muttering in his sleep, coordinates, bearings, and the same phrase again and again. We were almost home. Outside the camps, the world kept burning. The Ruhr raids continued, then Hamburg, then Berlin. Cities became wastelands of brick and ash. Each side justified the destruction as necessary, inevitable. Civilians on both fronts suffered alike. The firestorms didn't discriminate. Diaries from German mothers mirror those of British ones. Fear, hunger, loss. War had erased the lines between them. By 1945, when Germany finally fell silent, the survivors came home to a country changed beyond recognition. Streets were bombed out, ration lines longer than ever, faces older, harder. Many airmen returned to empty houses or to people who no longer knew how to speak of what had happened. The medals they received sat heavy in drawers. For those who didn't come home, their names were etched into cold stone. The memorial at Runnymede, listing more than 20,000 airmen with no known grave. Lancaster 409 was one of them. In the years that followed, Lane tried to rebuild his life. He married, moved south, and taught mathematics. His students never knew the details, only that he kept a small notebook on his desk, worn, leather-bound, always locked. Inside, he had written every name of his crew, every mission detail he could remember, every mistake he thought he'd made. He never spoke of the night again, except once. In 1974, during a BBC interview marking the anniversary of the war's end, Lane was asked what he remembered most. He paused for a long time, then said, "The silence after the engine stopped. That's what stays with you, the silence." And then he smiled faintly, as if apologizing for saying too much. Decades later, the wreck of Lancaster 409 would be found by archaeologists, twisted and buried beneath layers of silt and rust. The journals inside survived by chance. Sealed in a waterproof canister, the ink faded but legible. Among the entries were the final coordinates and a note scribbled hours before takeoff. "If we don't make it back, tell them we tried." The discovery reignited memories long buried. Families who had lived entire lives not knowing where their sons fell finally had a place to mourn. The Royal Air Force arranged a quiet ceremony at the site, attended by a handful of veterans and descendants. The sea was calm that day, the same cold grey as the morning they'd flown into the dark. When the last wreath was laid, one of the archaeologists said she could still smell oil in the air. Faint, but unmistakable. Perhaps it was imagination. Perhaps not. The ceremony ended without speeches or music. Only the sound of waves. Those who were there said it felt less like closure and more like the echo of a story finally told. War never ends cleanly. It lingers in the memories of those who survived, and in the silence of those who didn't. For the men of Lancaster 409, their story might have been forgotten, buried under mud, metal and time, if not for that single canister, sealed and waiting to be found. In the end, history didn't record their last words or final moments, but it remembered something greater, that even in a war built on destruction, courage could still exist quietly, in the choice to keep flying, even when the night was on fire. Chapter 5. The Weight of Memory. 80 years have passed since Lancaster 409 disappeared into the North Sea. Time has softened the edges of war, but not its shadow. Across Europe, memorials stand like quiet sentinels, stone and bronze reminders of a generation that carried the weight of history. Yet for most who pass them, the names carved there are just that, names. Only when the wreckage was found did the story become flesh again. When the discovery was announced in 2022, it made the news for a day, a brief headline between politics and weather. But for a few families, it meant everything. The descendants of Whitmore, Lane, Burns, and the others gathered at a small museum in Lincolnshire. They ran fingers over fragments of the aircraft displayed behind glass. Rusted metal, a pilot's buckle, a piece of navigation equipment still marked with Lane's handwriting. For a moment, history was no longer abstract. It breathed. A film crew recorded the excavation for a documentary. The narrator's voice, calm and reverent, spoke over shots of divers surfacing in grey water. They were young men, he said, sent into the dark to change the course of history. But what struck the families most wasn't the grandeur of it. It was the ordinariness. The handwriting in the journal, the cigarettes still sealed in a tin, a note scrawled in pencil. "Tell Mum the engines run smoother now." History, stripped of its distance, becomes human again. The recovered journal, now restored and archived, told not of tactics or targets, but of friendship, of Lane teasing Burns over his singing, of Whitmore's habit of checking the compass twice before takeoff, of Wallace's superstition about his flight gloves. They were not soldiers of myth. They were young, uncertain, and afraid, and they went anyway. Modern historians often ask whether the bombing campaigns were justified, whether the destruction they caused outweighed their strategic gain. The question remains painful and unresolved, but reading those words from Lancaster 409, It's clear the men who flew weren't philosophers or politicians. They were doing what they believed was their duty in a world gone mad. Their decisions were born not from ideology, but from survival, from loyalty, and from hope that someday their sacrifices would mean peace. Today, the crash site has been designated a war grave. The sea still moves above it, calm, indifferent, eternal. Visitors sometimes leave flowers on the nearby shore, though the wreck lies miles out, unreachable. On clear days, when the light hits the water just right, the waves shimmer with a faint metallic glint. Locals call it the silver line. Maybe it's just sunlight. Maybe it's something else. For David Lane, who lived to see peace, the memories never left. In his final years, he wrote to the families of his crewmates. "We thought we were flying toward victory," he said, "but mostly we were flying to keep each other alive." He passed away in 1988. At his funeral, a small group of veterans from his squadron attended, their uniforms carefully pressed, their medals gleaming in the grey light. They saluted once in silence. War has no tidy ending. It leaves behind echoes, in the quiet spaces of family stories, in the hesitation of a name remembered at dinner, in the old photos that survive longer than the faces that once smiled in them. The discovery of Lancaster 409 didn't just uncover wreckage. It reconnected lives. It reminded people that history is not made of dates or numbers, but of hearts that beat and then stopped. In classrooms today, students study the strategies of the war, the movements of armies, the speeches of leaders. But perhaps the real lessons are written in smaller print, in those brief diary entries, in the way Whitmore's crew said goodnight before takeoff, in the unspoken fear they all carried yet faced together. The war they fought is long over, yet the questions it raised still haunt us. What would we have done? Would we have flown? Would we have believed it was worth it? As the documentary's closing scene fades, the camera lingers on the sea, the same waters where the wreck still rests. The narrator's voice grows softer. They vanished into darkness, but their story returned with the light. There is a pause, long and deliberate, the sound of waves, the cry of gulls, a distant echo of engines that no longer fly. And then, just before the screen fades to black, a single line appears, the final entry from the journal of Flight Lancaster 409. "We are not afraid, only cold, but the stars are beautiful tonight." The music swells gently, then fades. The story ends where it began, in the silence of the sky. And the listener is left with that quiet, lingering truth, that history, once buried, never truly dies. It waits until we are ready to hear it again.